Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
It is this contrast, this way in which God enters into the pain of the fallen world, despite the Bible's claim that He is all-powerful and in many ways perfect being, that is the exceptional part of of what represents Christianity. I could make the comparison to Islam, in which you have a very sovereign God, but He exercises that power. And the compassion and relational elements of a religious faith are nowhere near as prominent in Islam as they are in Christianity and Judaism.
Oh, no, and couldn't be. I mean, some of the things you read in both Old and New Testament would be blasphemous to our Muslim neighbors.
Share the story of the debate that you had with the imam that you told me about yesterday.
Well, we had this public discussion that was effectively a debate, where, you know, he gave 20 minutes, I gave 20 minutes, 5-minute cross-examination.
Do you not call it debate in Australia? Is it always discussion?
Yeah, yes, we wanted to call it a discussion just to take the heat out of it.
Okay.
It didn't work. But, I mean, it was a very friendly conversation. And during
frank discussions were had by all. It's diplomatic language.
In our cross-examination, we were allowed, I think, 3 questions. It was quite a few years ago now. 3 questions of each other and then a response. So my question to him was, is there anywhere in the Quran, which I'd read cover to cover, or in the Hadiths, which I'd read quite a portion, where Allah is said to love those who are opposed to Him? And Dear Muhammad, this Muslim advocate in Australia, said, of course not. Are you saying there's one in the Bible? And of course, it gave me a great opportunity to talk about, well, actually, the heart of the message is that while we were still sinners, enemies of God, Christ came into the world to die for us. That's pretty much what we're on about, you know? And it was just such a clear night for people to see, whatever the value of the arguments, these are 2 very different conceptions of God. The Psalm 22, I often think of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? We hear that and we think of Jesus saying it, but if you just forget for a moment the later context, the psalmist felt you could say that to God and He wouldn't be upset with you. What does that say? Now, our Muslim neighbors will not use that sort of language to the Almighty. I cry out to you by day, but you do not listen. What's that about? I mean, and the lament Psalms.
Yeah, whole category.
It's something like a quarter of the book of Psalms. Now, that tradition speaks of a God who is so sympathetic with the plight of those who cry out, that you find most especially, obviously, in Jesus, who experienced injury and injustice and a final breath. And that God has entered into the ugliness. And if we can convey this through the content, but also the mode of our speaking, that we believe in that kind of God, I just think it's really powerful against the backdrop of a culture that thinks we're about the misuse of power.
The contrast is what draws people in. It raises an issue that I think is important to reflect on, and that is I often get asked, you know, when you're engaged in these kinds of conversations, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to win a debate or win a discussion? And part of me says, yeah, I'd really like to win that debate and win that discussion. But my initial goal is actually something more fundamental and more basic, and that is to get the person who I'm talking with to pause, to just reflect on, might there be another way to think about what we're talking about, with the hope that what I'm putting out on the table is something that they can recognize the potential merit of, and then open up to consider what is being said, because it's different than what they're used to hearing. And so it's a persuasion, but it's not a persuasion that kind of has a hammer over your head, believe this or else, but it's a persuasion that says, what I think I'm laying out on the table for you is actually a very helpful way to think about how humans should interact and live with one another. It really does. I like to say, it's not just true because it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible because it's true. And so when you flesh out what that truthfulness is, the goal is to explain truth or beauty, which is, I'm going to come back to this because I think there's an important thing wrapped up in that conversation, that there's a certain truthfulness, there's a certain effectiveness of living that's being represented that you hope the other person, particularly if they've never had any real exposure to the church or whatever exposure to the church they've had is what they've picked up in the static of the culture, a kind of cultural Christianity that gives them pause and they'll start to think. I actually think that's the key first step in doing what it is we're trying to do.
I couldn't agree more. I would only add that when you're doing it in the public square, when you're in the media and there are thousands of people watching, you also have to think about the many people watching.
Absolutely.
You and what is effective for them.
Yes.
So I often feel if I lose well in the debate or discussion with a journalist or whatever,
right,
but I've done it so well that I know the audience are thinking, actually that Christian guy was reasonable and level-headed and pretty nice. Actually, that commends the gospel. I mean, I don't go around trying to lose.
Yeah, right.
But I'm not so concerned about losing. My personality is, my instinct is to win.
Right.
But I think the gospel has slowly beaten Dickson into the expectation that losing well is sometimes a beautiful representation of the gospel for those looking on. And so I often find this in social media. So I've got quite a number of Facebook and Twitter followers, and sometimes atheists come and pursue me. And, sometimes they're so angry at me. And occasionally I say things that, I probably shouldn't have, a little bit smug or whatever. But generally, I am thinking, how are the many people watching this conversation responding? And often I'm quite happy when the atheist gets rabid because it's conveying something about their atheism. I think Richard Dawkins is actually doing us a favour in the long term because he is so extreme, so uncompromising. I think the average thoughtful doubter out there thinks, that's not an approach I like. I thought the Christian did a little bit better there. That is winning.
Yeah, it's funny that you say this because I just did a media panel for an event that was hosted in New York City by Biologos, and they asked me on a panel with another Christian and two journalists, and we were talking about how to engage the media. And I got asked, what's your primary goal when you go on the air? And I said, my primary goal is that I'm not so concerned with the opponent that the media often pitches me against, as the contrast. I am much more interested in how the audience is responding to what's happening than in my trying to defeat the person on the other side of the microphone who's taking a different position. My goal is to engage, but to engage in such a way that hopefully I am commending what it is that I represent, as opposed to winning a debate. And so the first rule I always have is I'm engaged in a conversation versus a debate. I'm not trying to win anything. All that I'm trying to do is to demonstrate what I hope is the reasonableness of what I believe in a way that will draw people in to consider what it is that's being said. That's very much what you're saying. And it was interesting because a lot of people in the audience after this presentation came up to me and said, I've done a few things on the media, and I've never thought of it that way. Their goal was I'm here to represent the position, and my goal is to win that conversation and win that debate. And again, it's not that you're trying to lose, but your goal is to understand that I'm probably not going to convince the guy on the other side of the microphone, but I'm interested in the person who's trying to decide which microphone am I going to believe, and hopefully draw them in my direction as opposed to the direction of the person who I may be.
And if we think of Christianity as not only true but good, then you've got to allow that sometimes you won't be able to convince an audience that it's true, but you might be able to convince them through tone and behavior that it's good. And if they have a sense that it's good and beautiful and drawing, then, you know, in some ways that's as good as convincing them in their head that there's a very good argument that Jesus, you know, rose again.
And in fact, it's probably the first step. It's a first step in moving them towards a potential recognition that maybe the way I've thought about this, there's another way to think about it.
And of course, that was C.S. Lewis's whole approach in the end. He came very much to believe that if he can convey the beauty of Christianity to people, it opens them up to the truth. I mean, he didn't draw a real dichotomy between those two things, but he was so aware that many of our beliefs about what's true are motivated by something. And so he wanted to convey the beauty of ideas to allow people to open up to the possibility that they're also true. To want it to be true is a step along the path to knowing it's true.
It's an interesting concept because, in fact, and you even see this in the way marketing is done, at least here in the United States. There is a pitch. I'm going to use advertising terminology. There's a pitch to the emotions as much as there is a pitch of the product. We just went through our Super Bowl, which is the equivalent of the Aussie Rules final. And
you've got much better ads, though.
Well, it really is a cultural experience. And I happened to watch it with someone who was from Germany, who lived in Germany. So I'm explaining these commercials to this European who's lived here for several years and has some understanding of culture, but not obviously hasn't been immersed in the details of our culture. And it was the constant question was, what does that have to do with the product? Okay. And this question must have come up a half dozen or more times during the game. And I said, really, it's not just the fact of the product. They're trying to create a feeling around the product. I mean, they're a very famous set of commercials. I don't know how famous they are, but they're widely distributed. I'm loving it. That's what McDonald's is pitching right now. You know, who loves a hamburger? I mean, well, you might like certain hamburgers, but who loves a McDonald's hamburger? McDonald's hamburgers, they're a dime a dozen. But they're trying to create a feeling around coming to the hamburger. Or another one, Budweiser, a beer. Their key image is the Clydesdale horse. And this German was looking at me going, what does a horse have to do with it? You know? And so I had to explain the history of how originally beer was delivered and that they've used this
You
horse
explained beer to a German?
I explained a beer commercial to a German. It's not the same thing. It's a good observation, though. And the point was, if you understood the history of what led originally to how the beer got to people, you understand why they used a horse to brand. And people, they feel something about these beautiful horses, these Clydesdales, that draw. And the point that I think we're making with this is that there is an opening up of the human soul through the depiction of beauty and value and positive emotion, if I can say it that way, that sometimes leads you into places that you wouldn't go normally rationally as your first stop.
Aristotle distinguished between two kinds of beauty in persuasion. I mean, we all know his logos, the intellectual argument, which he was a big fan of. But he also distinguished between pathos and ethos. And pathos, and they both refer to that emotional, psychological dimension of persuasion. But pathos was the more what the commercials are doing, making you feel warm fuzzies toward the thing. And Aristotle said, yeah, look, we've got to be honest with ourselves. We are all psychological beings, and we are drawn to arguments we just find more pleasurable, and that's why humour should be used in speeches. And he lays all this out in his book on rhetoric. But then he has this section on ethos, and he says this is the most important part of persuasion. So when Aristotle says, this is it, ready? You all listen. And he says, and he boils it down to this. We believe those with, I'll call it a humanitarian spirit. He uses the word epieikeia, which you find in Paul's letters translated as gentleness, but it really means that humanitarian regard, that moderate, fair, just character. We trust that person, the fair-minded, the good-hearted person, more than anyone else on all topics. He said the key to persuasion is if you are someone who is trustworthy in the eyes of the persuaded, that moves belief. So he said this is a beauty that is bound up with goodness. It isn't just beauty in the sense of emotional appeal. This is goodness. And he said this ethos is the primary part of persuasion, because we believe the fair-minded, those we perceive to be credible and fair-minded, far more easily than we do anyone else. And so if we can convey the goodness of Christianity to people, that it's credible, morally credible, loving, generous, compassionate, humble, all these things that just flow out of the gospel, then I think what happens is people long for that goodness, even if they're not 100% convinced it's based on anything rational. It's got the logos. Who knows if it's got the logos? But it's beautiful. That's the beauty, the goodness that I think what you call apologetics, what I call public Christianity, ought to be trying to convey, in addition to truth. Now,
there's another discussion that we had about Albert Camus that I think fits in nicely here as well. Well-known French atheist who, in the midst of his battles with Christianity, also interestingly had almost an appreciation for what its message was. And most people probably aren't even aware of this. So, I think it fits in here. Here's the critic talking about Christianity.
Well, he was the great atheist who said we live in an abyss of no hope. We scream out to the universe and it's utterly silent. That was his philosophy, and
a real lament psalm.
He was 100% lament. In the sense that. Nietzsche, for all of his atheism, had a rather chipper view of where we'll all go when we've got rid of Christianity, because the higher man is on the way. Once we get rid of that Christianity stuff and the way it holds everyone back, what will emerge? Natural selection will take over, the higher man will emerge, and brilliant. Well, Albert Camus couldn't buy that after 2 world wars. So Camus was a really interesting character, but he wrote an essay that wasn't published till after his death in 1960. And in this essay, he basically says, I don't have the quote off the top of my head, but he basically says, the cross of Jesus Christ is the answer to the cry of the soul in this despairing universe, if it were true. He says Golgotha changed the West forever, because what it did is it transformed the normal divine prerogatives, he said, so that God himself entered into the pain. Now, he died in January 1960. No one knows how far he took it, but there was more than a rumour that he'd been meeting with a Parisian pastor to read the Gospels. The pastor was sworn to secrecy, but it came out a decade or more later that he'd been reading the Gospels for his own trying to understand the figure of Jesus. So here is a man who was intellectually an atheist, but his heart seemed to be drawn to the answer that the cross gives.
The beauty of the cross, not just the truthfulness of it, but the beauty of it. I want to spend the remainder of our time on this beauty and truth thing, because I think it's something that you talk about that actually is important, and it's one of these translatable categories that I think truth has fallen on hard times in a postmodern world. It's people are trying to blow it to smithereens in one way or another, and basically say, there's your truth and my truth, and as long as it works for you, and all those kinds of things. But let's not think about some view from above kind of truth that doesn't exist anymore. But there is something that I don't think anyone can deny, and that is that there are places of beauty in the world. There are places where the orderliness of the world screams out and says and draws wonder. And there's a sense in which I think a key in explaining what Christianity is to show not only that it's true, but that in one sense it's beautiful. Develop that, because I think this is an idea that you talk about that I really resonates for me.
Well, yes. We have intuitions, as you say, that there's something beautiful and good, wonder. Mm-hmm. And even the atheists have spotted that their worldview is giving the impression that it was just a cold, rational worldview without any wonder. And so just very recently, they've all started talking about the wonder of that science gives you, because they know that human beings are wonder seekers in the sense that we long for the numinous, for the beautiful, for the good. So they're going there. But the problem that they're going to have is, what's it based on? Is it really just an instinct? Am I just a mammal whose chemicals act in a certain way when I see a sunset? Because in the end, that's what they have to say. Yes, that's right. Oh, but it's wonder. I want to say it's not wonder. It's no more wonder than, if I fall over and hurt myself. That is also a chemical reaction of the same status. Atheists have a real problem with beauty. And incidentally, A.N. Wilson, who was an atheist, a British intellectual atheist, wrote, terrible book on C.S. Lewis, terrible book on Jesus, highly skeptical, recently became a Christian. And in his published account in the New Statesman, I believe, it was this problem of beauty that convinced him Christianity must be true. Because he was listening, he said it was music. He was listening to the order in music. And he wondered, does he really believe the incredible experience he has when he listens to a great Mozart piece or whatever is simply a chemical reaction? Because he has to believe that if he believes that's not grounded in anything other than chemicals. And he had this kind of epiphany. I mean, his conversion wasn't entirely because of this, but he had this sense that I can't ground my wonder unless this is an echo of an inherent, imposed goodness.
A real design.
That has come from the purposeful actions of an artist. Only if the creation is good because it's come from someone who is good, can our sense of wonder be more than an instinct, but actually be true and beautiful at the same time.
Yeah, I find that the way I like to think about this is the exceptional fact of the earth, if I can say it that way. And think about what we know now versus when the Bible was written. We now know that the universe is far more vast and far more complex and far more fascinating and space-filled, if I can say it that way, than we ever imagined. And yet, here's this one speck. I mean, speck is generous. One speck in the universe where the atmosphere works, where there's water and air and plant life that generates all kinds, that sustains life. I mean, and you just look at it and you go, the exception that is, maybe one day we'll find that there's life somewhere. I mean, the universe is vast, but certainly in our near surroundings, we're a very, very exceptional piece, which raises the question of why life?
Yeah. Sometimes skeptics raise this as a reason not to believe in God because, look, the earth, all this space, it's wasted. Wasted time, wasted space. You may have been to the museum, the National Museum in Cairo, National Museum, 5 stories, beautiful. The Tutankhamun room. You walk in, it's a vast room with a tiny little box. And you realize that the vastness is actually meant to draw your eye to the beautiful box with Tutankhamun and all his all the gold hoard that they got with him. They don't want it to be a cluttered room. They make that room the special room.
Here is the one thing.
Yeah. The space is actually there to bring attention.
Yeah.
And to me, the earth in a vast space is doing a pretty good job of putting it on display. And isn't it fascinating that the opening theme of the Bible is the goodness and orderliness of creation? That sevenfold, it was good. It was good. And the seventh, it was very good. This is clearly trying to say, against a modern culture that would devalue creation, against ancient cultures that might, no, this intuition you have about the goodness and beauty of creation is not an instinct. It's based on the true goodness that is there because of the good God.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core starting point for talking about the gospel is the idea that we are creatures who have been created by a creator. There is a purpose and a design and a function in life that it's on one hand is mysterious but is there to be discovered, and that God has revealed himself. And really the gospel is about reconnecting us to this story of creation and the orderliness with which the world was originally created. To use your word, the beauty with which the world was created. We got done with the creation. We said it was very good. We might as well have said this is beautiful. The wife of Adam, Eve, is said to be wow. So it's about beauty, about design, and so that's where the gospel starts, and getting people reconnected. I love the Michelangelo portrait of the creation at the top of the Sistine Chapel. I love that picture of the finger of God touching the finger of humanity, and there's a I like to think of it as an electric connection. There's a relational connection that Michelangelo is portraying as designed and intended by the Creator. And really the gospel is about putting those two hands back in touch with one another.
Well, in Revelation 21:22, recall the garden image, turn up the volume on it, and how much of those last 2 chapters of the Bible are trying to convince you this is beautiful. All that stuff about what the streets are made of and the rivers and all it's beauty recovered.
It's lush. Yeah. It's and so there's a power in it that I think is important. And so I think one of the things that fascinates me about what you all are doing at CPX is that there is this whole, I would say, both relational and emotional, this very human dimension of engagement that you all are very much have your hands around and are trying to display and are conscious about thinking about, whereas most, and I'm going to use the word apologetics, most apologetics is operating at such a strictly rational level that it misses that connectedness of what it is that we're actually trying to do if we're not careful.
Yeah, it can happen. And, I'd want to offer the caveat that but maybe the audience doesn't know that we still, we stand up for truth.
Absolutely, all the time. Yep.
And we get people gigs on the topic of hell on national radio, right? So we don't avoid any
exactly right.
Any of the messiness.
Yeah, let's call that American. He can be our hell guy. Okay.
And we do gay marriage interviews, and we do all the hard stuff as well. But you're right. It's in this context of trying to convey the truth and the beauty of Christianity.
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, the danger here is that the defense of the faith can sometimes be seen as strictly an intellectual exercise, but it's actually a much more profound thing that we're after in terms of engagement. And the most important thing that we're after is trying to reflect, if you will, the character and engagement of God while engaging a world. And if we model what Jesus modeled, then I think it's an important step in the right direction. And that means taking the risk. That means, I like to say, I like to ask the question this way: considered from the world's standards, was Jesus' life a success? You know, the very fact that he went to the cross, the very fact that he ended up on a cross, you would go, well, if you were doing church growth statistics, that probably isn't the way your public relations firm would design what it is that was supposed to happen to Jesus. And yet out of that defeat, you could think of it that way. In fact, the scripture calls it a curse. Out of that curse comes the very potential for reversal that actually pulls the world back together. It's a profoundly counterintuitive way of thinking about how to fix things. And in that difference with the way the world might go about fixing things is the profundity of what I think Christianity and it's ultimately is all about.
It is. And of course, when Peter says that you're to give an apologia, he says, but do this with prautes kai phobos, gentleness and respect. Because you can't even defend this Lord that you set apart in your heart, always being prepared to give an answer. You can't defend that Lord without gentleness and respect.
And Colossians 4 and 5 goes to the same place. You know, it says, you know, let your speech with outsiders always be gracious. And so there's this interesting combination of moral challenge, conviction, as you have put it, and what I call invitation, moral challenge and invitation that's part of the way the Christian is supposed to function. You talked about it being conviction and compassion together. It's another way of thinking about it. And you've got to have both. It can't be one or the other, or else it will absolutely fail. Well, thank you, John, for being a part of our conversation about thinking about how to engage in the context of a cultural minority. Actually, what we've looked at is thinking about engagement from a biblical background and a biblical rootage, and I appreciate you helping us to do that. We thank you for being a part of the table where we discuss issues of God and culture, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/thetable. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.